Hello and welcome to this session, Working Memory, Long-Term Memory and Language Teaching. My name is Carol Lethaby and I am based in San Francisco, California, and I work mainly in teacher education, and I am also a materials writer for English language learners. Today I'm going to be talking about how we learn, as it says here, but I'm going to be focused particularly on working memory and long-term memory and what that means for English language teaching. We are going to look at a theory from cognitive psychology called cognitive load theory, and we're going to apply that to English language teaching and think about four particular strategies that we can use in English language teaching that take advantage of what we know about the working memory and the long-term memory and the relationship between them. We're going to start with a couple of definitions. First of all, working memory. Working memory is the memory system where small amounts of information are stored for a very short period of time. Okay, and this basically equates to what we're conscious of at any one time. As Clark, Kirschner and Sweller call it, the limited mental space in which we think. And the main and most important part about it is that it is limited. So the working memory is limited, and what this means is that we can only process a very limited amount of things at any one time. We think this is about 4 things, okay, and I'll explain a little more about that as we go along. It does seem to vary from person to person, but really we cannot hold very much in our working memory for very long. So when we're talking about the limits of working memory, what do we mean and how does this apply to language teaching? Well, basically, the limits, we can kind of look at the limits of working memory when we think about how much vocabulary we can teach someone in one go, how much new vocabulary we can teach in one go. Think about this. If you're trying to present some new vocabulary to beginner learners, how many can you introduce at one go? Well, if they're completely new items, not very many. And this is because of the limits of working memory. The long-term memory, on the other hand, is, as Sweller and Kirschner and Clark call it, the big mental warehouse of things we know. So this is what we know of as memory, really. This is where we store large amounts of information, and it's pretty permanent. So we can see from this that this is what we're trying to do when we teach, get information into long-term memory. And the long-term memory has no known limits. So this is really important for us to think about, isn't it? We can process large amounts of information and store it there in this long-term. So schemas provide a number of important functions that are relevant to learning. Firstly, as we've mentioned, they provide a system for organizing and storing knowledge. Okay, so they allow us to organize and store our knowledge so that it is there in an organized way and available to us in an organized way. Because secondly, they reduce working memory load, okay, and this is very important to cognitive load theory. This is because even though we've said there are a limited number of elements that can be held in working memory at one time, we said as few as 4, if you already have something in your long-term memory as a schema, this schema is just one single element in working memory. So you can see how by storing things in schemas, it allows us to work with our working memory our limited working memory to help us to kind of be able to learn new things more easily. This is again why what you know already, your background knowledge, your previous knowledge, is what's going to help you to learn new things, because it's not going to it's going to allow you to be able to use your working memory, the space, the limited space in your working memory, for new information. So by having these knowledge schemas, we can actually overcome the limitations of the working memory, because if we have things stored in our knowledge schemes and we can retrieve those things quickly and automatically through practice or rehearsal, that allows us to be able to connect with more of the new things that we're trying to learn, and enables us to learn to take on more new things in our working memory, because stuff that we already know that's in our schemas already is not taking up space in our working memory. All right, now to see, to kind of demonstrate how working memory and long-term memory work in combination, let's have a look. Let's do a small experiment. I'm going to show you a combination of letters. I want you to just try to remember this combination of letters, okay? All right, so just quickly to yourself, try and write them down without looking again at the sequence in the right order. Okay, now you probably found that a little bit challenging. Try it again now with this combination of letters. Okay, straight away you'll notice this is much, much easier, isn't it? Why? Well, because you have the word memory in your long-term memory. It's a word now, so that's how we're able to remember combinations of letters, by forming words, if you like, rather than learning them as individual items in our working memory. Okay, so all of this to say that our learners need to have good knowledge schemas. That's part of being a good learner, is being able to store your new information well into these knowledge schemes. All right, examples in language learning then. Well, a knowledge scheme, it could be how to greet someone. You have a scheme of an idea of all the different ways of greeting someone. Hi, hello, good morning, good evening, how are you today, etc. And when you learn a new one, if you already have a knowledge scheme of, okay, different ways to greet people, you can just attach a new one that you learned, good afternoon. Maybe you learn good afternoon, you just attach that one to your scheme of how to greet someone, rather than having to create a whole new one just by itself. Another example, how to talk about the past. If you learn that when you talk about the past, you add ed to a verb, and you use did not in the negative, and you use did to make questions, etc. when you're talking about the past. That means every time you come across a new verb and you want to use it in the past, you don't need to create a whole new knowledge scheme for talking about the past. You just add that new verb to your already existing knowledge scheme about talking about the past. So summary so far then, we've said that the working memory is limited and can hold only a few items, could be as few as 4, whereas the long-term memory has, we think so far, no limits, and our long-term memory is organized in terms of knowledge schemes. We don't just store things willy-nilly in our brains. All right, now that brings us to cognitive load theory. And cognitive load theory refers to the amount of mental effort required to complete a task. This is cognitive load. This is a theory from cognitive psychology. Now, the cognitive load theory part says that if the cognitive load is too high, the learner will not be successful in learning. So this brings us to thinking about, well, how can we help learners? How can this knowledge, the knowledge of working memory and long-term memory and what we know about cognitive load, how can this help us? Well, this is basically about designing task, instructional design. And what cognitive load says is that there are basically 3 types of load, mental effort. There's intrinsic load, extraneous load, and germane load. Okay, let's have a look at what those are. Intrinsic load then asks how difficult is the task inherently based on what the learner knows already. Now, if we think about this, this means, you know, clearly we should not be giving an advanced level task to beginner learners. Why not? Because the intrinsic load is going to be too high. There are going to be so many words and expressions in that task that the learner doesn't understand that it's just going to be too difficult for them, and the learner consequently won't be able to learn it. This also implies, as I've just suggested, that what has high intrinsic load for a beginner will probably have low intrinsic load for an advanced learner. So, you know, a text that's designed for a beginner learner will have the right amount, or should have the right amount of intrinsic load for the beginner, whereas an advanced text would be too hard, would have a high intrinsic load for a beginner, and could be at the right level though for an advanced learner. All right, the second type of load then that a task can have is so-called extraneous load. And this refers to all the extra visual or aural information required to process the new information in the working memory. And cognitive load theory says we need to minimize this. We need to get rid of any extra stuff which is kind of clogging up the working memory when it's trying to learn new things. And the third type of load is the so-called germane load. Now, germane load refers to the cognitive processing needed to integrate the new information into long-term memory. So again, what we've been talking about here, the way that learners can use their prior knowledge in their, you know, what they know already in their background knowledge to connect to new information and practice in order to make this information automatically retrievable. And what we're trying to do through the tasks and the pre-tasks that we set learners is we're trying to optimize the germane load. So we're trying to create tasks which are going to help learners to connect old and new information. So in 1994, Bjork coined the term desirable difficulty. That's this Bjork, not this Bjork, by the way. And what he meant by that was tasks that are challenging but attainable. They're at exactly that kind of sweet point where they are, they have cognitive load, they have some cognitive load to challenge the learner, but it's still accomplishable. And he argues that such tasks are what improve long-term performance or learning. Right, how do we create desirable difficulty then? Well, according to cognitive load theory, by doing 2 things, by minimizing extraneous load and by optimizing germane load. Okay, don't worry, I'm going to talk more about what that means now. Okay, one important thing to remember when we're talking about cognitive load theory is, as Sweller talks about, second language learners in particular are constantly under high cognitive load. Why? Well, because they're trying to make sense of everything around them in a second language. So you've got 2 layers, if you like, of cognitive load going on, trying to make sense and learn new things in a language that you don't understand. Okay, let's consider then the strategies that work with cognitive load theory in language teaching. How can we apply this theory of cognitive load to language teaching? So there are four main strategies I'd like to point out and talk about. Firstly, this idea of reviewing previously studied information before going on to learn something new. Secondly, the idea of using more direct or more explicit teaching with beginners rather than using discovery learning, okay? And we'll talk more about that in a minute. Thirdly, the idea in general when we're designing materials, when we're giving instructions and rubrics, of omitting extraneous or redundant language or information. And fourthly, combining text and visuals in such a way that they support each other, okay? And we'll look at what that means and how we do that. Okay, so our first one then is reviewing previously studied information before going on to learn something new. Okay, so why is this useful? Well, basically what we're doing here is optimizing germane load. This means we're helping learners to activate what they know already so that this information, which is stored in the long-term memory, is available when learners are learning new things, and this allows working memory to be freed up to allow them to learn new things and connect it to what they already know. Okay, so that's what we're talking about here with optimizing germane load. All right, so an example of this would be going back to our example of learning a new greeting. Before we teach learners, maybe they're about to learn good afternoon. Before we do that, we remind them that they know already good morning, good evening, hello, hi. And then that allows them, when you teach them the new one, the old ones, they've already retrieved them, they know where they are, and it allows them to organize their new greeting, to learn the new greeting and connect it to the ones they already know and store it in their knowledge schemas. All right, second strategy then, we said this idea of using direct or explicit teaching with beginners rather than discovery learning. All right, what do I mean by this? Well, first of all, what is discovery learning? Well, discovery learning basically means when learners are not provided with the answer, but they're just given the materials and data to try and find the answer by themselves. And very often we assume that this is better for learners. You know, we think that we learn better if we discover things for ourselves, and that somehow this is, you know, it causes deeper processing or whatever. But do we really? And this is the question that that I want to just explore a little bit with you now. Say we're doing a presentation, we want to compare two people. And we're going to compare Chris Hemsworth and Tom Cruise in class. Okay, we're going to compare them, and what are their good and bad points? This is a presentation I've done many times with learners. So we have information about Chris, we have information about Tom, and we say, okay, now look at the language. Can you work out the rules for adjectives when we compare people? So we have all these examples, and now we're asking learners to work out the rules. Okay, so what we're trying to get them to do, obviously, is to notice the patterns, to discover the rules for when you form comparative forms of adjectives. But if you notice, there are a few potential problems there for learners. Okay, first of all, maybe there aren't enough examples. We've only given one or two examples, so how can you possibly work out the rules from one or two examples only? Secondly, maybe there are too many rules. There are quite a few spelling rules as well, and there are actually 3 to 4 rules with the formation of comparative adjectives, aren't there? Thirdly, the learner just doesn't have enough information to make these generalizations. They need to know how many syllables. Well, they need to know what is a syllable. All these kinds of things that that require information. Fourthly, if we're working with lots of different adjectives, what about if the learners don't actually know all the adjectives? If some of the adjectives are new to them as well, and they're trying to work out the rules in this pattern for the formation of comparative adjectives, this is increasing cognitive load and can be actually distracting them from the task of finding the pattern for the formation of comparative adjectives. Okay, so does this mean I'm saying, oh, we should explicitly teach all of grammar rules, so kind of, you know, one by one go through all the grammar rules? That's absolutely not what I'm saying at all. But what I am arguing is that what we need to do is, as we talked before, is to optimize the germane load, so to help learners to process the information that we're giving them. And that could be by using explicit instruction, making the teaching point very, very clear for learners, making sure that learners have enough examples to be able to make their generalization. Use known vocabulary wherever possible, so that that's one less cognitive load that we're giving learners. Minimize the extraneous load. We'll be talking more about that in a minute. Don't include redundant or irrelevant information. Scaffold and guide the learners, so we can give them lots of help to guide them to the answers that we're looking for, whereby we're not completely throwing the learner in at the deep end and frustrating the learner, but rather we're helping them with the information that they'll need to be able to work things out, if you like. So are things we can ask them, how many syllables are there in the adjectives? Is there only one way to use adjectives to compare? What do you add to the short adjectives? What happens if it's a long adjective? So we can kind of gradually, bit by bit, add more information to really help the learner to understand what it is that we want them to find out about forming comparative adjectives. Okay, minimizing extraneous load then. What are we talking about here? Well, extraneous load is the extra visual and or auditory information required to process new information in working memory. That's the official definition. Now, this is related to what is called in cognitive load theory the redundancy effect. So this is additional information that's not directly relevant to learning, or repeated information in multiple forms is not helpful to learners. Now, this is something that often we think is helpful for learners. We think repeating information lots of different ways or adding extra information is useful to learners. But in fact, what's happening is, if we're not careful, it's overloading the working memory. And as we've seen before, if the working memory gets overloaded, something has to give and learners are going to forget something. Example of redundancy. This is an experiment from Butcher. And what she did was she gave learners two different pictures of the heart, and went with a recording, and they had to listen and read and say, look at how the heart worked. And if you notice which one of these pictures looks more like the heart, this one does. But for the purposes of learning how the heart worked, it was found that this diagram, this on the left, A, was actually better than this more realistic diagram, B. Okay, why? Well, probably because it contained redundant information. Okay, another type of redundant information comes in the form of what cognitive load theory calls the split attention effect. And that means when learners have to process two or more sources of information at the same time. As Sweller says, learners should not be required to search for needed information. What does this mean in practice? We do this all the time, don't we? As you read something, we ask learners to look up words you don't know in the dictionary. This is an example of split attention, and this is straining working memory. As you read, match the words in bold to the definitions on your handout. So you're looking at the text here in one place, and then you're looking at the definitions on a handout over here. This is something else which cognitive load theory says just adds extra load, extra unnecessary load to learners. So does that mean then we should only use either visual or auditory information? No, it actually doesn't, because of the so-called modality effect. The modality effect in cognitive load theory says that using more than one source of information can decrease the extraneous load, the auditory and visual extraneous load. Okay, but the two must support each other, and that's the secret, isn't it? Making sure that the two support each other. So, for example, in this case, the example I gave you before of the simplified and the detailed drawings. Simplified drawings are often more effective than the true-to-life ones when used in conjunction with an oral explanation because of cognitive load. There's too much load in this picture. There's all that redundancy, and there's all these extra details of things that the learner doesn't need. And in fact, the simplification takes away that extraneous load. Okay, so when combining text and visuals then, here are a couple of important points to bear in mind. First of all, text and visuals must support each other for learning to take place. Okay, that's the important point here. And secondly, when we're combining text and visuals, we have to make sure that we cut out any of that extraneous load, any of that redundant extra visual or auditory information that learners don't need and that may be distracting them and adding to their load, their cognitive load. And at the same time, we want to try to optimize germane load by creating tasks that encourage learners to connect new information with what they know already. That is, to encourage schema, organization and building. And in this way, we're trying to create desirable difficulty, tasks that have cognitive load, but which are not overwhelming and won't overload the learner when they're trying to carry out the task. And this, we think, is what is going to lead to long-term retention of new information. So here we see an example of a text. This is a kind of a common text about sleep, so a very common topic that learners will know something about. And what we're going to do here is think about how can we use the visuals to support the text. Okay, so a couple of ideas here. So we're trying to look at how do the visuals support the text, and how can we create this desirable difficulty that we've talked about by optimizing the germane load. All right, I have a couple of ideas on this. Okay, we want to encourage learners to think about what they know already. Okay, so in the pre-task, we're going to ask learners to think about what they already know about sleep and what helps you to sleep and what makes it more difficult for you to sleep, so that they can think about what they know already, so that they can incorporate the new information from the text into this knowledge scheme that they have about sleep. Secondly, we want them to help them to look at the pictures and identify what is going to come in the text in English. So we're not just helping in terms of the concepts, the actual content, we're thinking also about the language that learners are going to come across. Okay, and a third idea, playing the text as audio and having the learners identify the items on the visual as they hear them. So we've got things like dripping taps, crying baby, ticking clock. So all these kinds of things that may be new for the learners, we can check first of all that learners know the word on the before they read and before they listen, but then as they do listen to the text, we can ask them to identify those objects on the picture, on the visual, so that the two are supporting each other. Okay, so we've looked today then at this idea of cognitive load theory, and we've talked about 4 easy strategies in the classroom that we can do that will work with this idea of cognitive load. We've talked about reviewing previously studied information before going on to learn something new. We've talked about using direct or more direct, more explicit teaching with beginner learners rather than discovery learning, so that we don't overload learners cognitively. We've talked about omitting extraneous or redundant language or information. And we've talked about combining text and visuals so that they support each other. Okay, so to summarize what we've looked at today, we've talked about how the working memory is short and very limited. We've said the long-term memory, on the other hand, is limitless. And how can we use that information to help us teaching? Well, we've said the theory of cognitive load says that there are 3 types of effort on the brain. This intrinsic cognitive load, extraneous cognitive load, and germane cognitive load. And what we need to do when we're teaching is we need to minimize the extraneous cognitive load and optimize the germane load when we're teaching new things. And this means, is what we're hoping, is that tasks in this case can then be designed carefully so that they are effective and at the right level, what Bjork calls desirable difficulty. That's what we're aiming for. Okay, these are a few of the important references from the session today. And I think we have a few minutes for questions now, so I'd be very pleased to answer your questions. Thank you very much for your attention. So this has been working memory, long-term memory, and language teaching, and I'm Carol Lethaby.